Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark and have a happy Groundhog Day, everybody. My guest today is Dr. Jen Thum. Jen, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am my title is very long, doesn't tell you exactly what I do, but I'll give it to you and then I'll tell you what I do. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Engagement and Campus Partnerships and a research curator at the Harvard Art Museums. And my job is kind of I have my feet in two places. One of them, the majority of my job, is museum education, and the other is in ancient art. And I'm an Egyptologist, so specifically, it's ancient Egyptian art and archaeology. And I do all kinds of things in this job. Most of it is interdisciplinary teaching at the university level, so college students and grad students coming from all different fields who are visiting our museum with their classes. And that can be like so many different topics. Just this week alone, I had a class from the design school called Urban Design for Planners, where we looked at paintings that were showing different urban landscapes. And we also used some ancient art for that class as well. Um, let's see. Also, this week we had a course on like nationhood and art and things like that. Sometimes I have environmental science classes, foreign language classes. So this is like this big project of making people feel that the museum is for them, even if they're not an art person or an art history major, something like that. So in addition to that, I work on curatorial projects. So the last exhibition that I curated at the Harvard Art Museums with my colleague Laura was called Seeing in Art and Medicine. And it's based on a program that I teach also at the museum for radiology residents at Harvard Medical School who are working on things in their practice, like empathy for their patients and um, how to be more objective in their work. And we do that all with works of art. So that's a program that I teach, and I did an exhibition about it. I also run a training program for grad students where I teach them how to do object-based learning. And then they go and take that information and they teach visits to our museum for classes from the local public high school down the street. So there's a kind of intergenerational aspect to that part of my work. And then I also teach for the grad school of education at Harvard. I teach a course on learning in museums, which actually just started this semester last week. So I've seen my class twice already. So it's a fun mix of like lots of other people's classes coming to the museums, and now in the spring, every spring, my own class, and kind of remembering what it's like to have a full term course of your own, I think helps you work better with other faculty. So I love doing that.
Yeah, and that's something that, I don't think people realize when they go just visit a museum that there's no such thing as like a slow day at a museum. It's like something different every day.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's this, well, we know from like data about museum visitors that not just our museum, like across the country, that most people spend about like something like 28 seconds, I think less than 30 seconds in front of a work of art when they visit a museum. A lot of people have this idea that they have to see the highlights and then they have to do them very quickly, that they have to take selfies with the art or take pictures of it to prove that they were there. We're not taught to slow down really at all in our lives today. And it's the same in museums. So it takes a lot of like rethinking how you relate to spaces and objects to you have to really practice like sitting with something and thinking about it because we're used to getting information so quickly. So a lot of my work is inviting students to sit with something and really consider the object that's in front of them. Ancient art is so good for that because a lot of the time you can touch it also in our museum, at least.
Yeah, and that's something that we, as museum people want to do is activate not just like the sense of sight while you're looking at something. You want to see it and touch it, and then it's real after you do that.
Yeah, I think like one of my favorite things to do. Can I tell you about one of my favorite things to do with students?
Absolutely.
So I I love to see the reactions from students when they encounter an ancient object up close, like really up close for the first time, because it's so unbelievable to most people. One of my favorite things to do is, especially if it's a class of like first year undergrads or an interdisciplinary class where they don't consider themselves to be museum goers or art people or anything like that. I like to take out a group of objects that can be handled. So I usually do this with ushabtis, which are the funerary figurines from ancient Egypt. There are about 50 of them in our care at the Harvard Art Museums, and most of them are in storage, so I can take them out. We have a few study rooms where we can do this. And I arrange them in the room beforehand in groups. So they're made in multiples because people had lots of them in their tombs. So if we have multiples, I put them together. If they're singles, they go on their own, and I just lay them out in front of the chairs. And I start in that room instead of in the gallery where things are already on display and they have labels. And I invite students in and I tell them just to gravitate toward an object that interests them and sit in front of it, and the whole like first 3, 4 minutes is just them looking and holding the objects. And I tell them like, pick it up, turn it around. Obviously, like we tell them to be careful and how to do that safely, but the like shock of touching an ancient object and like how intimate that encounter is really kind of amazing to watch. But it's also about trust. Like if I'm telling you like you can hold this object, like I trust you that like this is a thing for you, it's so empowering for students. And then I use that like firsthand encounter, like where they're really looking at and feeling the material of the thing. I use that to then start conversations about what those objects are. And we can talk about all kinds of things with ushabtis. Like we talk about, because they're spread all over the world from large groups, we talk about provenance, we talk about materiality, we talk about like the science behind the materials that they're made of, all kinds of topics. And also, um, because they belong to individual people and they usually have people's names on them, it's a great way to remind everyone that there is an ancient person behind this object and to talk about personhood too. So I love those encounters and I try to do them as much as I can. Whenever it makes sense to do it with a class, that's the thing that I like to start with.
Yeah, there's something about seeing the look on, especially like a student's face when they touch something and they realize how old it is, and it actually, it takes a couple minutes, but it sinks into this thing has been on this planet for, hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it is still in good enough condition where you can actually learn something from it.
Yeah, and I mean, another just that because you mentioned condition, another thing to learn from this though is that a lot of the time ancient objects have been conserved. And that's another really interesting thing about museums that I think a lot of people don't um, necessarily know until they have an encounter like this, is that there are also hands at the museum that are working to make something look closer to what it did originally, or to patch it up, or to leave parts of a broken object clearly marked that they've been restored. Like those conservation choices are really interesting to talk about with students too. So even in the cases where it's not in great condition, it's also really interesting, and it's a great way for them to learn about museums and how they work and who works in them.
Yeah, and that's again something else I don't think people really think about when they go into a museum is how much work actually takes to make a piece of something presentable, whether it's just like a piece of pottery or an actual like painting. Both take a tremendous amount of effort just to keep clean and presentable and nice.
Yeah. And the other thing people ask me about all the time, not just with ancient art, but really everything, is about like the voices behind the labels. Like that there's also not usually like a full understanding of how many people have a say in what goes in those labels and like all of those choices in a gallery. And that there's like at our museum, there's an editorial team. There are often many people like collaborating together on a label. There's research, but also like the fact that things change over time. Like in a label, for example, that we can change our minds. there's this idea that like museums are that what you read in the label is the authoritative voice, and like the museum knows what it's talking about all the time and everything, and there is an absolute fact that's not changing, where actually like sometimes we find something out that's new about an object and we update the label, or sometimes someone discovers something that we didn't know before outside of the museum and they tell us, and because of outside feedback we change the label. So that's another area of like kind of where I would love to see museums like demystify a little bit. And this reminds me of like, I guess the big thing about why I am so invested in like interdisciplinary teaching is because I really want everyone to feel like the museum is a place for them. And so my main goals when I have students or really anybody in front of an object with me are what I call museum literacy, which is like learning how a museum works, like understanding like some of the specialized terms that we use, and what kinds of jobs there are in a museum, and all the different ways that you can engage with an object and feel like you know kind of know what you're doing. And museum going identity, which is like the sense that you feel like you're a museum goer, like you belong here. So those are always like the undercurrent of everything that I'm trying to do. It's like if you come with your, environmental science class, yeah, you're going to learn some environmental science stuff. Like we're going to look at some landscapes and we'll talk about it together. But my real goal is that you leave feeling like you understand museums a little bit better and you feel like they're a place for you.
Yeah, and that, like you said, museum literacy, that's something that I think every institution struggles with, especially if they're in like a STEM based field. People automatically come in and they're like, oh, I don't have like a fancy science degree. I'm not going to understand anything that goes on here. But that's the exact opposite. We strive to put things in a language to where anybody can understand it. You don't have to feel, we don't want you to feel stupid when you leave.
For sure. We don't want to alienate people. And I mean, but museums have a long way to go in this area. Like, I think, like, because historically museums have felt like very exclusive spaces, or they've had very high, some still do have very high prices to pay to enter. You feel like you have to make the most of it and that there's a certain way to do that. And that's just not true, or shouldn't be true. Actually, we just we were always free for students, but we just started over the summer having free admission for everyone, and it's absolutely changed how people use our museum. Like people know because they don't have to like make the most of whatever the cost of a ticket is anymore. They come in and just like go and look at something for 15 minutes and then pop back out again, and like that's amazing. Like those smaller encounters with museums are that's like how you get to feel like you're comfortable in a space, is just going back a bunch of times, and you can do that if it's free.
Well, that's something else that I just thought about. If you take like an intro to art history or just like a basic art class, they'll often send you to like a local museum as part of your grade. And then, you look at the one thing they want you to look at, and then you look at, the two or three things that are next to it, and they're like, okay, I want to live here now.
Did you do I should ask, have you ever you've had this feeling yourself, or
I absolutely have. So anytime I go somewhere new, the museums are like my first stop after,
yeah.
a nap or the bathroom, depending on how long the car ride or plane ride was. But yeah, I stop at a museum just about everywhere I go, assuming it's open on the day of the week that I'm there.
Yeah. It's funny because like I feel like I behave so differently as a museum visitor than I like expect other visitors to behave when they visit our museum. Like when I'll give you an example. Like I usually don't read labels when I visit another museum. I don't know why. If it's a special exhibition, I do. But if it's like I'm looking at permanent collection or something, I just look at the objects. But I do still expect that, because I also write labels sometimes, and like because of the way engaging with people with what's on our walls, like I think I still kind of expect that a lot of them will read the labels, even though I don't do that myself. So I'm trying to like teach myself to remember, also from my own perspective, like all these different kinds of visitors, like how you can use the museum's didactics, or not use them at all. It's something funny about the way I am when I visit museums.
Yeah, I do that too. Ever since I had to like write an actual exhibit label, I noticed that I take more time to read labels now than I would have when I was just like visiting. Now I do it as like part of my job. I'm like, wow, the label is short.
Yeah. But some people, we had this like, well, length is a really interesting thing. Like, I have always been taught, and like all the museums that I've worked in or interned in, that like shorter is better. But I guess what you're saying is like for you, there's definitely such a thing as too short. Like, I want to know more. Like, why can't you tell me more? That's kind of interesting because I am such a wordy writer. Like, I always have to cut down. Like, everything I write is always too long, and I like have to strip out all those like unnecessary adjectives, and I like want to describe everything in a really like drawn out way. So it's nice to know that maybe some people do want longer labels.
Well, it comes with, studying archaeology and reading the labels that some people make for an archaeological exhibit. Like if you're looking at something like a glass fragment that's, this big, you can only gain so much from just that tiny fragment. Like you can get the color, the chemical composites, and maybe it has just a couple letters from the maker's mark on it. Other than that, you really can't get that much from it at just like a glancing view in a museum.
That's true. We have this like also, well, yeah, of course, like small things often end up in groups in a large case with just like really, really minimal labeling. And yeah, maybe, well, sometimes because there's not so much that you can say, but also like, I don't love when a label tells me what I can see. Like, I want it to tell me something else. Like, if I'm gonna take the time to go and read it, like because I'm expecting it to teach me something, I want it to go beyond just what I can already see with my eyes. So I want it to give me like a behind the scenes view, or like some kind of something that I would never know without reading it. So in the cases where I've gone to a museum and I do decide to read the labels and it's describing something to me, I feel like that's not doing enough. And for ancient art, like it's a tricky spot, right? Like take Egyptian art, for example. Oh, the iconography, the way things are like depicted, because Egyptians draw the human form and lots of other things very differently than a lot of people do today. Um, the the text that's, if you don't read hieroglyphs, the text that's on an object, like all of that you can see, but you don't necessarily know what it means if you haven't studied Egyptian art. So you actually do have to have that kind of picked apart for you. Um, but I think like there are probably some really some better ways of like striking a nice balance between helping people see better what they're seeing and then giving them also like more information that they wouldn't have otherwise. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, actually.
Well, this is something that, just popped into my mind since COVID. A lot of museums have gone to like a digital catalog for their objects. And when they digitize the object, the catalog description lets them put more information than a text panel would.
Oh, this reminds me of another kind of interesting thing about the way what we say about objects, because of how we do this in our own museum. Our whole collection is online. So if anybody watching, listening wants to go to harvardartmuseums.org/collections, you can see everything. Almost every ancient object should also have a photo, but there's definitely a record online. One of the things that shows up in the online record, but doesn't show up, or historically has not shown up in the labels, for anything, not just ancient art, is the provenance of the work. So for anybody watching or listening who doesn't know that word, that is the trajectory of an object's life. In the case of something ancient, it would be from the ground to the gallery if it's in a museum, and all of the different hands that it's passed through. And there are a lot of reasons why provenance, knowing an object's provenance, is really important. One of them is establishing the legal ownership of an object. But also, like, I find that students and members of the public, because there have been a lot of high profile cases of objects having to be returned to their countries of origin because they were actually not owned legally recently. A lot of students and members of the public ask me about provenance. Um, they expect museums to really be responsible um, for like surfacing that information. And so it hasn't been on our labels. It's just been in the online record. So we started to do something that a little more than a year ago. I worked with a team of colleagues on an exhibition of funerary portraits from Rome and Egypt at our museum. And for the first time, we decided not only to put the provenance of the object in the label, but also to do what we called narrative provenance. So like usually when you look at a provenance line, like if you were to go to our website right now and look up an object, the provenance line is like a bunch of short phrases separated by semicolons. And like they're very hard to understand, even for a museum worker. Like they're not easy to read, and it's like basically the chain of ownership separated by semicolons. We took that information for every object in our exhibition and we turned it into a narrative. It was very simple to do. It was like just making full sentences that were easier to understand out of this information. And when we did that, it meant that the visitor could understand that this is all the information that we know about where this came from. Some of it we don't know, like maybe there's a gap in the provenance, and to be really open and transparent about the fact that sometimes we don't have some of these answers. And it's like related to this bigger issue in museums, which is that like we we have like historically shied away from talking about the complicated and often really problematic practices that people used to do in archaeology and museums, like looting and things like that. And we should talk openly about them. Like we shouldn't, shy away from that, because it's an opportunity for us to like um, correct the course that we're on, to be more transparent about things that we would never do anymore in archaeology or museums, but that past people did, and to teach people why those practices are wrong.
Yeah, that's something a lot of museums, especially here in the Southeast where I am, is repatriation has become like a cornerstone of museum operations. Like there are people specifically on staff just to see that something is returned to its rightful owners. And then they also create like a display out of it saying, it'll give like a short description of what the object was and then why it's being returned to whomever the rightful owner might be.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Like I have not seen a display like that myself in person, but it's like that transparency, people appreciate that. And it's also part of museum literacy, right? It's like explaining why the museum shouldn't own something, and like just so much more about like how like the inner workings of the like human relationships and institutional relationships that are at the heart of museum work. So it's like you're part of a way broader network of people and institutions when you work in a museum, I think, than a lot of people realize. And you have a lot of
That
responsibility.
That and it's just really good for a human standpoint that we've taken into consideration people's voices who have been, overlooked in history up until this point.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring that up, because one of the things that I wanted to talk about is not really well, it is, I guess it relates to provenance, but is this issue I said like a little bit about earlier, which was about personhood. It's like there are contemporary living communities where people want these objects back and they are rightfully theirs, and museums return them. But there are also ancient people who are implicated in museum practice. And a lot of past museum practice has like ignored the real ancient individuals that there are behind these objects. Like I think it's so strange that we walk by all of these, or every museum visitor who's gone to an ancient museum with an ancient collection has walks by all these objects that belong in someone's tomb as if it's completely normal. And often they're objects that had human remains in them, like urns and things like that, that are now empty, or coffins, sarcophagi, and that we were so like desensitized to that. Like I remember going to museums as a kid, I thought it was totally normal that there would be like a mummified individual in a gallery. I didn't think twice about it. So it's become so normal for us that we forget that there are real people behind these objects. So this is another thing like that we're doing in our museum, and I've seen a lot of other museums really start to grapple with, is like, how do you center that ancient person? One of my colleagues just did a project, I guess it finished last year, but the labels are up now, called Caring for the Dead at the Harvard Art Museums. Her name is Caitlin. So Caitlin took a series of objects that are on display from different parts of the ancient world and rewrote the labels so they're more like epitaphs. So they like talk about the person as a person, or they ask a question if we don't know, like, whose tomb did this belong to? If there's a personal name on the object, like talking about them as a person and really appealing to like our emotion, our empathy, to help people understand that like this really is not just about the museum goer. Like there's another person here, and we should really try to get as close to respecting their wishes as possible since they're not here anymore.
Yeah, and that's, again, something we have an obligation for as museum professionals is speaking for people who aren't necessarily here anymore, or somebody who was overlooked in history because they weren't somebody of, high status or something like that.
Oh, that's another thing. Like everyone expects, especially for Egypt, they expect to see royal people's things in a museum. And it's one of the reasons why I like to take out those ushabtis for people. They did belong to elite people, the ones that are in our care, but they represent a really broad range of people, and they have their names and titles on them and things like that. Like the idea that it can still be super interesting, maybe even more interesting, to have an encounter with a more ordinary or a non-royal person, and their objects from ancient Egypt, I think is like really just reminds you that like most people weren't royal and there were a lot of interesting things about everyday life in Egypt too. So and everyday people's deaths as well.
Yeah, that's something that, people like can't seem to separate in, especially in Egyptology, is like I guess the magic of Egypt, or what they perceive as the magic of Egypt. Like, oh, we're gonna show you this like tomb object, and people are already like, okay, so what's the curse on this, and how do I avoid it?
I get these questions all the time. Yeah, people ask me like, do I believe in the mummy's curse and this kind of thing? Like my answer to those questions is like I always try to really ground it in like tangible evidence. So for that question, for example, the way I answer it is I tell them about how we do that there are tombs where people wrote like um messages warning people basically not to disturb their tomb, warning living people, not in ancient people, not to disturb their tomb, and writing something that is like a curse, like I hope all these bad things happen to you if you disturb my tomb, like don't disturb me. That this is something that they did, but that this is not a quote unquote magical thing. This is a practical thing, and then I relate it back to the idea that like you probably would not want someone to dig up your grave and put you in a museum or your things. You probably wouldn't want to be disturbed either, and I think that question can then lead to like people moving away from this kind of like weird like fetishizing of ancient Egypt and like making it seem, exotic or something like this, and toward again thinking about like how we have a kind of shared humanity with people of the past, and it really is about real people and all of the just very human things, human concerns that we share with them.
Yeah, but it also, the script for those kind of movies writes itself once they just find a single object. And you're like, well, this is obviously cursed, and we're going to make a multi-million-dollar movie out of it.
Yeah. Well, okay, so the like battle against pop culture ancient Egypt has been like, I guess it's kind of what has motivated a lot of my work. So many of my most maybe at this point, most of my publications are really geared toward like, how do we teach with ancient Egyptian objects, and how do we like responsibly talk about them as a way of countering some of the pop culture narratives about Egypt, but also some of the like way more fringe ideas, the kind of conspiracy ideas that exist. Because I there's Egyptology is a strange field in that it's so like it's so present. It's a scientific field, and yet it there are so many people who have so much to say about it, and a lot of them are saying things that probably should not be said. So to put it in a very diplomatic kind of way. So a lot of my work is about like, no, here's like what we actually think, and here's the evidence for that, and like let's dial it back. Let's come back to a place of like, what does the evidence show us, and like what are the interesting questions we can ask, instead of this like kind of wild speculation, which also really does a disservice to the ancient Egyptians. Like, for example, the people who I don't even want to say it, the people who say aliens built the pyramids, that's a disservice to the ancient Egyptians. Like, first of all, that theory comes from white supremacy. It comes from the idea that like ancient Egyptians couldn't have done this, and since white people didn't do it, like it must have been aliens. But it's also like, it's like just not appreciating the like teamwork and skill and like collective mindset that it took to build something like that. And like, you would have wanted to work on a pyramid. Like, it's for your king. It's an incredible project. Like, what an amazing, like, I think people would have been really proud to work on this. It's like, oh, come on, like, give them credit for what they did. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like people have an aversion to giving people credit for the invention of geometry and complex architecture. The aqueduct is still in Rome, guys. The water still flows through it. It's really nice.
It still works. I know.
Yeah, it still works. 2,000, 3,000 years later, I'm really bad at keeping track of how old it's.
It's fine. But yeah, like I really find that like well, what I want to do is I want to, especially with young people, I want to give them the chance to have these encounters with the ancient past where they don't have to think in these fantastical ways, where instead they can be like, oh, these were real people, and relate to them on a person to person level. And it's sometimes hard to do that. But a lot of my work is thinking about how do we teach in ways that like are moving away from like all these stereotypes about the ancient past, any avenue that might get someone toward aliens or mummies, curses, or whatever. How do we move ourselves like closer to understanding like the humanity of ancient people? And that's how we're going to get at more like evidence-based encounters, I think. Like picking up an object that an ancient person touched, like that's amazing.
So we've talked about a lot of topics today, Jen. Say you're a student who's watched this episode. What advice would you give them to get them started on the correct path? Notice I'm saying the correct path. Don't go down the ancient aliens tinfoil hat path, please.
That's kind of tricky. I feel like, well, what I so one piece of advice I would give is like, if you're a student and you already are like, okay, I want to do this ethical, responsible teaching. One piece of advice I would give is to talk to people about what you do. Like, I think there is something about like meeting someone who has done archaeology, meeting an archaeology student, meeting a professional archaeologist, like actually having the like a conversation with someone who does that work that can help people move away from those like conspiracy theories. So talking to people about what you do, answering their questions, just like ordinary people, like, as students progress in their careers, they'll give lectures and things like that. They'll go to conferences, but I think it is so important to talk to everyday people, just your neighbors, your friends, like people you meet at like a archaeology fair, something like that, about what you do, to give them a direct line to someone who's really doing the work, who's not Indiana Jones, but like an actual person. Yeah.
They'll be the same age as Indiana Jones more often than not because no one
Yeah.
actually retires from archaeology or museum work. We just kind of disappear one day.
Yeah, it's magic.
That's the only magic we subscribe to in the
Yeah.
fields of archaeology, museum studies, what have you. No one ever actually retires.
Right. And actually, probably a lot of people should make way for the next generation. So, well, not even probably, like, I think I would love to see an archaeology that really supports more young scholars in the field doing this kind of community work, talking to ordinary people, appreciating like outreach as a thing that you should really be doing in archaeology, not just your academic work, because it's so important, and that's how archaeology is going to affect real people.
Well, Jen, it has been great having you on the show. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Same. It was so nice to meet you, Daniel. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank all of you for joining us on your maybe busy Groundhog Day. I don't know what other people do on Groundhog Day other than go look for a groundhog and pull it out of the ground. Don't do that. The groundhog lives there. You don't. Bye, everybody.